One more time. I'll treat you like I treat my own students. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Excellent. I want to start by thanking you for the kind introduction, Feller, but also for having me here today. I've been really pleasantly surprised by how enjoyable of a time I've been having here at IU East. It's a beautiful campus. The faculty have been really fun to interact with. I'm looking forward to meeting some of the students perhaps afterwards as well. So thank you for welcoming me and just allowing me to have such an enjoyable time over the last few days. I also really appreciate all of you today for coming, taking a few moments out of your day to listen and learn about some of the economic outcomes that's gotten surrounding an issue that's gotten a lot of attention over the last decade, a lot of national attention over the last decade, and that's recreational marijuana legalization. Today we're going to look at what happens when marijuana becomes legal, not in terms of crime rates or public finance revenues. No, we'll mention both of those. They're interesting, they're important, but crime rates and especially public finance revenues, you're probably not as interested in as how recreational marijuana, how legalization affects individual choice and health behavioral outcomes. So we're going to spend a few moments today thinking about that. In particular, we're going to look at today this idea of couch locked with the munchies, considering what happens when public policy, personal choice, and a little bit of weed gets mixed all together in changing the American health landscape. I will give you a bit of just a warning. This is, I consider, fun research. Most people think of economics and economists as not having any fun doing any research. This is a topic I've had a lot of fun with. It's one of those topics that are probably best reserved or most reserved for late night comedy specials, right? Some bit about getting the couch lock or getting the munchies. It's something that I initially joked about with my dad maybe 12, 13 years ago. Before legalization of sales actually occurred, we were like, I wonder if people actually do get the munchies, right? And we were joking about it, but it's this idea that economists can take these tropes that Hollywood portrays and turns them into serious conversations. And so hopefully you'll have some fun learning about something that you may or may not already have the answer to, but let's look at a data-driven solution to see what the results actually indicate. Now to begin, I always like to start presentations on a topic like this considering the historical precedents that we have, some institutional details in place at a national level, because we will see momentarily that states make their own choices. But I also want to highlight some of the relevance for this policy and the question that we're asking in a broader framework of the institutional details that exist. In thinking about this, what we'll see is that U.S. sentiment, U.S. policies regarding the accessibility and availability of marijuana have really come full circle over the last 100 years. This might surprise some of you. If you look at this slide, what do you notice on this slide? Anybody notice anything? What sticks out to you as you look at this slide? So this will be interactive. We can make this an interactive discussion. If you have something that you don't agree with or you want to ask a question during the presentation, you can ask me questions, but I'm going to reciprocate. I'm going to ask you questions as well. What do you notice? Anything?
It's a weed farm just out in the open.
It's a weed farm just out in the open. That's pretty shocking. Anything else you notice?
It's coming in like a bottle or like an elixir instead of just being a
An elixir. What you should start to notice, especially if you focus on how this guy looks, if you look at this advertisement and this bottle, you should start to notice there are some very old things being portrayed on this slide. Marijuana has a long history in the United States. Before 1900, in the 1800s, we had this legal status of what I would consider the commodity era. All of a sudden we have this situation where hemp is related to weed. The THC content isn't quite the same, which THC is the reaction or the portion of marijuana that gives you that high feeling. But hemp was a popular fiber crop back in the 1800s. It was heavily subsidized and encouraged for production. It was useful for rope production. It was useful for fabric production. So there was a lot of hemp farms that existed during that period. On top of that, we had medicinal uses for marijuana being introduced to American pharmacies in as early as the 1850s. So this isn't a new concept at all. On top of that, what I don't show on this slide is by the end of the 1800s, hashish houses were gaining popularity in big cities across the United States. Now, hashish is a cannabis resin that would be consumed either through edibles or through drinks. Doesn't sound too unfamiliar to what we have in today's landscape. Enter the 1900s. This is the era, I can date myself a little bit, this is the era that I grew up in. What do you notice now? What's changed? What do you see on this slide that looks maybe a little different from what we saw on the last slide? Quiet crowd. That's okay. How about we define this era? Yeah.
War on drugs.
War on drugs. It's the Prohibition era, right? The war on drugs. Accessibility quickly changed in the 1900s. The federal government got involved. The federal government enacted 4 key legislative acts that criminalized marijuana on a national scale. And most people cite those 4 federal acts as being the drivers for this war on drugs. What I like to remind people, though, that they don't often know when it comes to this war on drugs, is that it wasn't the federal government's initiative at first. What we had seen prior to the federal government getting involved was states were already criminalizing and making marijuana consumption and accessibility illegal. Prior to the federal government getting involved, 34 states had already criminalized marijuana for recreational use by 1933. In fact, one of the states, the early adopters of recreational marijuana lately, Washington, they had criminalized possession of marijuana by 1923. What I find fascinating about that is people cite these legislative acts, they look at the war on drugs and they say this is a huge federal push. Well, what did we notice? The states were the ones leading the charge toward criminalization, and now what do we notice? States are the ones leading the charge for decriminalization. Again, U.S. sentiment has completely come full circle over the last 100 years. And I find that fascinating. Fast forward to today, the era that it looks like, excluding some of the professors in the room, you have all grown up in. What do you notice now? We see states who are removing penalties for possessing, purchasing, and using recreational marijuana. Does anybody know the first state to allow recreational marijuana sales and access? Colorado and Washington were the first to legalize this in 2012. Now, what you'll notice on this slide, I did mention I will talk about some of the boring public finance related issues. But what you notice is it was legalized in 2012, but it wasn't until 2014 until sales actually started taking off. A number of states, as you can quickly surmise or guess, have followed suit since those 2012 passages by Washington and Colorado. This hasn't come without friction. Legalization isn't just a, oh yes, everybody's in favor of it or everybody's against it. There's a lot of friction and a lot of contention surrounding the legalization in today's landscape. I have a few parades here that show you the pro-marijuana policy side. Being in Indiana, a state that I believe legislatively just recently said that it's not going to go up for a vote, you probably know some of these arguments. Anybody know some of the arguments supporting or opposing recreational marijuana usage? Have you heard any of these arguments? Trust me, I'll keep asking questions. Why might people be in support of legalizing recreational marijuana? And you can use these pictures on the slide as a hint. maybe you can't see those. Mass incarceration. Proponents contend that legalization will lead to lower prosecutions for marijuana possession offenses, which is a crime that's often racially and economically biased. We're incarcerating people unjustly or unfairly for something that, in a lot of people's mind, isn't that big of a deal. A lot of people associate the effects or the benefits or the cost that you think with marijuana as being similar to that of alcohol. So the argument is we're really affecting a lot of individuals' lives in the short term and the long term by making this what's still classified as a Schedule I narcotic. That's a pretty high offense at the federal level for possessing this product. So the goal is, well, maybe we can lower prosecution rates. And the initial evidence has been there. In Washington state alone, I looked up some of these numbers, between 2009 and 2012, right before it was legalized, there was an average of about 6,800 criminal marijuana offenses. That's 6,800 offenses per year from 2009 through 2012. In 2013, once it was legalized and the laws were in place, that went from almost 7,000 to 120 offenses that year. So we can see that those numbers are already telling us that we're changing the landscape of this negative outcome for a lot of individuals for something that a lot of people wouldn't even say was that big of a deal, perhaps in the first place. Another argument, if we go back to this idea of war on drugs, people say we need to stop wasting taxpayer money. Right? A lot of money was invested in programs that weren't really having a large effect on reducing the amount that people were actually consuming in the first place. So they said it's an ineffective use of taxpayer funds, so we need to reserve those for different purposes. Or we need to allow cops to find or catch more offensive criminal offenses during their watch rather than just trying to find out if somebody's got weed on them or not. And so that's another argument in support. Another argument in support that I've seen recently, unemployment rates in Colorado, they contend, or estimations have shown, unemployment rates have actually gone down once legalization was in place, creating jobs, giving other opportunities. So that's the proponents. What about the opponent side? What might be some arguments for why marijuana shouldn't be legalized? You guys haven't heard these arguments before?
It's like a gateway drug.
It's a gateway drug. Right? That's one of the key arguments against. One of the concerns is if we have greater access for older individuals, what's that going to lead to? Greater opportunities for young people. It might now be a gateway drug for them to go into either more serious crimes or more serious narcotics in the future. However, the results on that have already been mixed. States that adopt these policies generally have lower opioid overuse and deaths than states that haven't. So again, it's contentious. You always have to ask, well, who's asking the question? Who are they funded by? Are they funded by somebody? But there is evidence against that as well. It's a gateway drug. If we think about more access for underage youth, right? Brains don't fully develop. I don't think mine fully developed until 35. But brains don't fully develop until well into adulthood. Right? Now we have some potentially serious negative consequences if, in fact, underage youth do get access to these marijuana products. Right? We're talking about links between marijuana use, behavioral and cognitive impairments, poor academic performance, attention memory deficits, increased high school dropouts, depression, anxiety, addiction, and these are serious outcomes. And so there is reason to pause and be concerned about how accessible these products are in the first place. So it's one of those arguments that we always joke, two-armed economists. On the one hand, on the other hand. It's not an easy answer. Regardless of your side on this debate, we can see that the appeal from the state and local jurisdiction perspective is there. The tax revenue that's been generated from legalizing recreational marijuana has been incredibly high. Cumulatively, the states that have legalized marijuana have collected over $20 billion in tax revenue. So that's only a fraction of the amount of sales that have actually taken place. $20 billion in tax revenue. If you think about Indiana's neighbors, Indiana is the only state that has no legal status for marijuana amongst its neighbors. Even Kentucky has medical marijuana. But if we consider Indiana's neighbors that have recreational marijuana, Michigan, where I'm from, we've collected over $1 billion in tax revenue since 2019. In 5 years, the state's collected over $1 billion of tax revenue. And that's going toward funding education, public infrastructure, is going to local jurisdictions to determine how they want to use that money. Although that's where I start to have a problem. It's not very open on how they're using that money. That'll be a topic for future research. Is this actually creating any positive benefit? The potential's there, but we don't know if the outcomes are actually supporting that potential. That's Michigan. Illinois. In 2024, they recorded over $2 billion in cannabis sales and almost $500 million in that year alone in tax revenue. Ohio, they just passed recreational marijuana. Since August of 2024, they already reported over $240 million in sales. So the potential is there. You can see why states might be being appealed and wanting to make this a policy that's put in place. As we've seen over the past decade, momentum for marijuana legalization continues to build. So we're getting some interesting results, and it's not showing any evidence of slowing down. The reflection of what we're seeing with legalization is a reflection of how U.S. individuals feel about marijuana itself. Sentiment has changed drastically over a 40-year period, 50-year period. Back in 1970, roughly 12% of individuals supported legalization. By 2000, we were up to 34%. So in 30 years, you went from 12 to 34, so almost 3 times as much. 20 years later, we're up to over 68%. It's doubled in the last 20 years. If we add to this, not only is support for legalization growing, the number of people consuming and using marijuana is increasing, which shouldn't be surprising. As it becomes legal, more people will consume this product. The Americans who have ever tried marijuana has increased over 20 percentage points in the last 20 years. That's pretty substantial. The percentage of smokers has doubled in the last 10 years, from 7% to over 17%. And that's the percentage of people actually smoking marijuana. So the shift isn't just political, it's not there just for states collecting tax revenue, it's cultural, it's behavioral, and it's quite widespread across the nation. Perhaps not surprising. Something else we should start to understand, well, how widespread is this becoming? What you'll notice on this slide is everything that's green are states that have marijuana legalized for medical use. And those laws can vary depending on how they want to incorporate those laws and what types of diseases or sicknesses they want to cover for medical marijuana. But everything in green has medical marijuana. Everything in blue has recreational marijuana. Now everything in blue also could be shaded green. Medical marijuana has always predated or come along with or before recreational marijuana. That's a lot of states. 39 states right now have medical marijuana laws on the books. 24 of them have recreational marijuana. Of the 24, 22 states allow retail sales. They have some mechanism where an individual can go to a store and buy a product that has marijuana or THC content in that product. If we look at the big picture, marijuana is no longer an isolated experiment. It's no longer examined for a few case studies or a few states themselves. Right? It's a national trend. This is something that's occurring nationwide. However, little is really known. We're passing all of these policies without pausing understanding the full ramifications. Little is known about the health impacts on these policies, the health impacts that perhaps we should be considering along with providing this information. As an economist, we like to say, more information is always better, so let's dive into what health impacts could be taking place. Our two questions in the research that I've been working on include, how do these recreational marijuana laws affect the general public in terms of physical activity? And how do they affect the general public in terms of food consumption? And we're not the first to ask these questions, but we're the first with the approach we take, the combined data sets we use for understanding not just one or the other in isolation, but both questions together. And we're the first to use newer data techniques that allow us to have more precise and better estimates than what was previously seen before. However, before we get into these questions, you might be thinking, some of you may or may not be thinking this, it might be dependent on your age, not to call anyone out here, but you might be thinking, what do physical activity and food consumption have to do with the title of the presentation, couch lock and the munchies? What do those terms even mean, and how do they relate to these two questions? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Let's start with the easy one. Here's the slow pitch softball question. What does the munchies indicate, and how does that relate to our questions on the slide?
Makes you hungrier, so it's going to increase your food consumption.
Louder?
The munchies, which should make you hungrier, so...
Yeah, the munchies. I'm going to be hungrier. Should increase food consumption. What type of foods might we stereotypically associate with people who have the munchies?
Chips, cookies,
Yeah.
some snacks.
Cheetos, right? Chips, cookies, ice cream. High calorically dense foods. Sweets, salty snacks. I've always joked, what I should have done when marijuana was legalized in Michigan is I should find every retailer and just open up an exclusive Cheeto store next door, right? Man, would I make a killing. That was the joke. Now we'll know in fact whether or not I would. So that's the munchies, that's the easy one. What about couch lock? Have you guys heard this term before? No? That's okay. So I wasn't familiar with couch lock at first. I had to Urban Dictionary what couch lock was, because I was trying to come up with a fun title for our paper. And I'm like, what's a fun title for, this behavior? And it came up with couch lock. But to share with you, I'm going to enter what I consider the obligatory artificial intelligence slide. I've made it a habit these days, as I think most people do when they give presentations, to ask ChatGPT's help for defining these concepts. And I always ask ChatGPT, could you give me a definition of this in a way that I could explain it to my grandma? So this is what GPT had to say. Couch lock, slang, a state of extreme relaxation or a sedation after consuming cannabis, typically to the point where the user feels physically unable or unmotivated to get up from the couch. Munchies, slang, intense and sudden hunger that some people experience after consuming cannabis, often leading to cravings for salty, sweet, or high-calorie snack foods. Now that's one thing, those are long definitions, they're a little boring. So with the aid of ChatGPT, I said, let's make this a little easier for people to remember. We don't want to remember all of those words. So it came up with the following two characters. Right? These are characters in jokes that probably feel pretty familiar. Why? You see this trope over and over again. And these stereotypes are typically played for laughs, but they're rooted in assumptions about real behavioral change. Right? So now we have, is that Spagoli? I can never remember his name. Spagoli? Spicoli? Yeah. When your body says, nah, brah, we live here now. Right? Now, most of you just cringed because you heard millennial use your slang, right? The munchies, the moment when everything in your pantry becomes a 5-star meal. In public policy, especially when it comes to health and wellness, the assumptions, whether or not these tropes, these stereotypes play out, have real health and serious health implications. So what we're essentially doing in this paper is we're asking, are these outcomes real Or are these just Hollywood exaggerations that we have for laughs? What actually happens? In short, we're turning the stoner stereotype into a testable hypothesis using data-driven research. So what does the research say about marijuana and exercise? Again, we're not the very first to be asking these questions. People have looked at this in isolation. The evidence so far has been mixed. There's been documentation of more minutes of aerobic and anaerobic exercise, people enjoying their exercise experience more. They have reduced anxiety, reduced pain, so on and so forth. Why might that question be a little different than what we're pursuing? When you think about reduced pain, reduced anxiety, what type of marijuana consumption might we be targeting? Recreational or medicinal marijuana. So we're going to add to that. Is there something else to be garnered or seen by including recreational marijuana in this debate? We also see increased sedentary behavior. Television time goes up, sitting time goes up, people are just staying more at home. Now what you might not have picked up on this, but perhaps you have, not only have a lot of these studies been focused on medical marijuana legalization and its impacts, but did you notice the people we have exercising here? How do they look different from the people I had a few slides ago? Age. What's different about their age?
Older and younger.
Older and younger. A lot of these previous studies are looking at the effects, probably for medical marijuana, on elderly populations, or they're looking at these effects on youth. We need to now bring in new data, fresh questions, to see in a broader policy environment, how does this affect broader populations? We're not going to target this to one subset of the population. We want to see overall, how do populations respond when legalization of recreational marijuana takes place. Let's shift to eating. There have been 3 buckets of research concerning eating. Again, we're not the first to ask, do people eat more food? We're the first to ask it with new data and new methods and combining that with exercise. But the most of the research that's been done falls within this first bucket. It's clinical or survey data. Right? They're looking at physiological changes. This clinical data, they get 10 male participants, and they give half of them placebo weed and the other half real, and then they monitor their food cravings after consumption to see what's changing. That's a very small set of the sample. There have been people who've asked these questions, or they're looking at different types of the population. How do people who smoke their entire lives respond differently than people who haven't when we bring them into clinical trials? That's a very different question. Small populations, making sure that they're ingesting cannabinoids, and then seeing how their appetite and food preference changes. There has started to become some larger scale studies that are looking at now reported food purchasing and consumption behavior. Not a lot of literature on that end, but we are starting to see some of those studies pick up because recreational marijuana is becoming a widely popular policy. And then finally, we have public health studies using cross-national data that's starting to pull away from survey data or clinical trials, trying to use actual estimates of consumer purchases rather than consumer surveys on what consumers say they're doing. Right? We want to know what they're actually doing, not just what they think they remember. Again, if we recall the attention memory deficits that marijuana might cause, maybe they don't remember exactly what they just consumed. What are their wallets actually showing? One of the first studies that looked at this was Baggio and Chong in 2020. They got consumer panel data, same data that we'll be using, but they really narrowed in on what's happening in recreational marijuana states. I think it was mostly just Colorado and Washington at that time. What's happening to ice cream, chip, and cookie consumption when it becomes legal? What do you think they found out? It increased. Roughly 5% for each of those. What might be wrong with just asking that question in isolation? We don't know what's happening overall. Just because they're increasing their chip or cookie consumption, we don't know if their calories are going up or down. Are they substituting that away from some other consumption? That's an important question, right? Yeah, maybe I eat 10 more cookies over the weekend, but I feel bad about that, so I'm now exercising more during the week to counteract that, and maybe I'm not eating any cookies during the week, or maybe I'm skipping a meal or two to counteract that higher caloric intake. They were looking at that in isolation, and so great question, great results, but we're missing a component. I looked at this question, I actually did some research with an undergraduate student a few years ago, where we looked at the state of Washington and we said, how is taxable food purchases changing once legalization takes place? Now, taxable food in Washington is prepared food, which is typically higher calorie food than unprepared food, right? You don't think of a stoner, getting the munchies and then saying, hey, you know what sounds really good right now? A stir fry, right? No, oh, you know what sounds really good right now? That food that's easily accessible, that generally has higher calories. Now, what was important about that study was we were looking at taxable food, but we were also looking at all food purchases. Was untaxable or non-taxable food changing? Were restaurant food purchases changing? And we found taxable food was going up with no change elsewhere. So now we're starting to understand maybe they aren't substituting this behavior away. But now we can use a more national approach, different data sets, to understand not just what people may do or a few isolated incidents, whether it be my study only looking at one state or Baggio and Chong's study looking at only a few types of food. Now we can see what happens, not just on what people may do, but what they actually do. So what do we take away from all of this? Right, the story is still unfolding. It gives us reason to keep looking at these types of questions. So our contribution, or what we want to walk away with today, understanding not just some history about marijuana and recreational marijuana in the US, but what's the effect of recreational marijuana controlling for this medical marijuana status. We're going to incorporate some new national level data sets to evaluate not just the effect of food or the effect of exercise, but the effect of both. And we also incorporate new methods. Economics, the way we analyze this data is constantly changing, and we're getting better and better methods, so we're going to incorporate some of those new methods for understanding the research outcomes from these questions. I'm not going to bore you too much with these details, but these are important to understand how we approach these questions as economists. We were able to use the BRFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System data, which is a very large data set that's widely used in health economics related research. It's a national survey done monthly that allows us to monitor people's health behaviors, their preventative health care, and their chronic health conditions. It's a very useful data set. On top of that, for exercise, we access the ATUS, the American Time Use Survey from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, to record not just what they're saying they're doing, but how, when, and where they spend their time. We can compare both of these data sets now to say, are they telling us the same story, or are they telling us different stories? If they're telling us different stories, we then have to be concerned. Which one's true? Which one's false? But if they're telling us the same story, we have a nice, consistent message in our findings related to the questions we're asking. In thinking about how economists approach these kinds of questions, again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but economists don't just get to do experiments. Now, experiments are gaining popularity, but why can't economists do experiments? Anybody have any guesses as to why they don't let economists do experiments? What might be some issues with that? What would the experiment look like? Natural scientists get to use experiments all the time. I have a close friend who's a herpetologist. He studies frogs. What does he get to do? He gets a population of frogs, and then he takes some of them and he puts them in a controlled environment, and he takes some others, puts them in a similarly controlled environment, but changes a factor or two. And then he gets to observe the different outcomes. That's cool. I wish I could do that. They don't let me do that. Why don't they let economists run those kinds of experiments?
You have no control.
What's that?
You have no control
Well, no control could be an issue.
for outside factors, so maybe serious consequences may happen.
Serious consequences may happen.
Yeah.
Maybe seriously unethical consequences may happen.
Yes.
Right? If we think about this, what if I sat in this room and I just divided you guys down the line and I said, all of you, we're going to just let you get an 8th grade education. The rest of you, we'll let you get a PhD. That'd be a pretty interesting experiment. Then we would say, well, we're going to observe the outcomes over your life on what you earn, your health, all of these benefits. Right? But I'm just going to divide you. Or I say, this side of the room, you guys, we're going to require you to smoke 12 packs of cigarettes a day, and you guys can't have any. Right? You start to see some of the issues that are surrounding that natural experiment design that economists would love to be able to do, but there's some serious ethical consequences as a result. So they don't let us just do that. So what we have to do is we have to understand, well, states adopt policies. Sometimes states adopt them, others don't. Laws change. There's unexpected court rulings. We use and we look for changes in society that allow us to do a natural experiment type approach. If you look at this slide, you can think about this as DC has a soda tax, but right outside of DC doesn't have a soda tax. So we look at, okay, before their soda tax, what did they look like? Did they look similar to the no soda tax place? And then after, we compare them before, we compare them after, using the different policies to understand what the effects are. It's like a natural experiment that policy is giving us. And that's how we approach these types of questions. We don't get to collect our own data, we have to use secondary data, but we utilize law changes, court rulings, administrative rulings to understand outcomes on an economic level. It's actually a little more complicated than that. This was my view of the world when I first got my PhD. It was pretty simple. This difference in differences technique that we utilize was the gold standard. But what did we realize shortly after? Well, states don't just turn on and off at the same time. Washington, Colorado, they enacted recreational marijuana in 2012. Michigan didn't legalize it until 2018. Ohio didn't legalize it until 2024. I think Illinois was around 2020. It's not just an on-off before-after view. It's what I would consider a popcorn effect. Anybody ever microwave popcorn or cook popcorn on a stove? Popcorn doesn't all just pop at once. You have one kernel pop over here. A second later, you have another kernel pop. And you have another kernel pop. And that's what we're recognizing is we have to take advantage of what we call a staggered treatment design to estimate these effects. If we compare this treated group with both of these treated groups over this entire period, you're going to start to really muddy the waters. But if you can look at this slide behind the scenes, what does this look like to you? Weeds. We're getting too much into the weeds now. The actual techniques we use aren't important for today's conversation, but recognizing that we have some advanced, sophisticated methods for answering these questions is the most important component. And if you want to talk more about this after today's lecture, you can come talk to me about this. Here is a table that we had to create that shows you all of the dates of passage for these different marijuana legalization. We have medical marijuana when it was effective and when sales started in each state. Now, why might that be important to control for approval, effective, and sales? We use sales as the real catalyst, But we have to maybe control for or recognize that even before retail sales were allowed at the state level, people were still accessing recreational marijuana. Not legally purchasing it, but they were still purchasing it. There were loopholes in the law. I find these loopholes fascinating. Right? You couldn't buy weed from somebody, but you know what you could buy from them? You could buy a mug that just so happened to be filled with weed. I'm buying that mug. There were loopholes in place. So people, we need to control for those, because having the product, even though you couldn't legally purchase the product, having the product was legal, but it wasn't the purchases, or there wasn't any state-sanctioned areas to actually make those purchases before that. So we need to consider all of those different times. But again, what should you see? Medical marijuana is basically in place before recreational marijuana in all locations. And some locations still don't have recreational marijuana that had medical marijuana before. Again, what you should start to notice is this allows us to look at that staggered treatment, difference in different design, recognizing that the corn is popping at different points over time. Again, I don't want to bog you down with this. This is my obligatory modeling slide. Economists in the room love this stuff. Anybody ever been to an econ conference presentation before? They love bogging you down with equations. Equation after equation after equation. I'm always like trying to follow the logic and the line. This is our obligatory equation slide. This is for the economists in the room, or even the non-economists who just love equations. This is the model that we set up to estimate this effect. Now what we really want to focus on this slide is the outcomes of interest. These are using the data that we collected, what we're going to measure these policy changes on. What are they impacting? We measure it in terms of exercise overall. Are people exercising less or more? Again, we had mixed results. Remember, some people exercise more because they have less anxiety. Why might people be anxious about exercising? Have you been to a gym recently? I haven't been to a gym in 10 years. I work out at home. I don't want TikTok influencers, saying stitch incoming, and there I am looking like an idiot. See the youths of today laughing at that one. But people might be self-conscious about going to the gym. So reduced anxiety could increase their gym use. But we look at exercise, we look at cardio exercise in particular. Are people running more or less? We look at time spent at home, time spent at the gym, outdoor time, work time, store time, restaurant and bar time. Again, these should all tell a consistent story. If they're spending time less at the gym, they should be spending less time working out. Unless they're like me and they've switched their preference. If they're spending less time at the gym in these other locations, they should probably be spending more time at home. This has implications for what we might expect with their food consumption habits. So again, these outcomes of interest are what are important in this slide. In thinking about this, what did we find? Using the Burfus data, we see a decrease in exercise, which was predominantly driven by a decrease in cardio. Now, we measured other forms of exercise, weight training, all of these things. Even though I have my undergrad student that I published with, he said we need to do a study on weight training. He's like, those guys use it as a way to overcome, just feeling anything, and they can lift more weights, and I don't know the science behind it. But he claims that there's something there to be picked up. But decrease in exercise driven by cardio. When we use the other data, right, if we have a decrease in exercise, it's probably going to lead to a decrease in gym time. And yes, in fact, we see that with another data set. Decrease in gym time, decreased time outdoors. That could also be related to exercise. I'm not hiking as much. I love running outside. And we have increased time at home. Now, I'm not going to give you all the numbers. Again, economists love to provide tables, and you get instantly overwhelmed with numbers and stars on these with statistical significance. I'll, at the end of today, show you how the numbers that we did get translate into caloric intake or a reduction in caloric expenditure, and what that means overall on how much weight we might be able to expect people to gain in the long run, or even in the short run. So that's exercise. Any questions? Pretty straightforward. Now, it looks straightforward. There's a lot of work that goes into even getting estimates as simple as this. We move to eating. We use the same data set, essentially, that Baggio and Chong were able to use, but we used it in a slightly different way, and we did a national examination of this data. Again, this is focusing on Nielsen IQ retail scanner level data, where we can look at individuals' purchases over time, where they're spending their money, how much of their money they're spending, how much of their money they're spending on certain types of goods. It's a very, very just incredible wealth of knowledge that can be garnered from a data set like that. It's a great data set. So we were looking at money spent on snacks, chips, cookies, candies, and ice cream, much like Baggio and Chong, but we used it more than just looking at those individual purchases. Again, we're using the same type of approach. Let's not bog ourselves down with the approach that we're using, but what are the outcomes of interest? Now we're looking at how it affects daily purchases, how it affects trips to grocery stores that involve junk food, and the money that people are spending on those junk food items. Again, the results perhaps aren't too surprising. What did we notice? An increase in junk food spending, an increase in household junk food trips, increase in number of junk food trips, although they're getting a decrease in overall trips altogether, and an increase in those sweet and salty snacks that people associate with the munchies. So what are the implications? What do you expect to be the result? What are people doing? They're exercising less, they're spending more time at home, they're eating more junk food. So what might we expect people to do? Some of the actual numbers we get, if we look at these, we get this from assuming 20% of adults use marijuana. That is the actual recent estimates on states where recreational marijuana is legal. 1 in 5 adults are consuming cannabis products. That's a lot. 1 in 5. How do they change their behavior? Well, again, they're exercising less. About 6% less time spent exercising, 15 minutes less spent outdoors, 30 minutes less per week. This is per week at the gym. If they're spending less time outdoors and more time at the gym, or less time at the gym, where are they at? They're at home. What are they doing while they're at home? They're eating. They're eating. They're buying 20 to 40% more junk food, and they're making more trips to the grocery store to get junk food than they had before. So even though legalization doesn't just change what's allowed, it's actually affecting people's behavior on what they're consuming and how they're spending their time. If we really want to think about this, the average user is burning, and these are back of the envelope calculations. This is going to vary from individual to individual, but based on the estimates that we've come up with, the average user is burning 250 fewer calories. They're consuming 300 more calories, and that's each week, which leads to a surplus of 550 calories on average per week, or 8 pounds per year on average. So the question becomes, could recreational marijuana contribute to lifestyle-driven morbidity? The answer is, it's a strong possibility based on the estimates that we're coming up with. The question then becomes, what do we do with this information? Right? Because it's fun to ask questions. It's fun to find answers to those questions. It's fun to say, oh, the Hollywood tropes do have actual reality, realistic outcomes. But then what do we do with these outcomes? Any suggestions on what you would do with information like this? Because policy has allowed legalization to take place. What do we do with this policy? Any thoughts? How do you combat this from happening? What's that?
Abstinence. Just don't do it.
Abstinence is a possibility. We came up with a few just silly, I don't know if they're silly or good, but we said, maybe you take the soda tax approach and you tax it even more than it already is. right, to reduce consumption. But a product like marijuana and alcohol generally have fairly inelastic demand. So you can tax a lot, you're not going to change behavior a whole lot. Maybe you put warning labels on the products when people go to purchase this product, right? It may cause drowsiness. You're going to gain 8 more pounds per year. You've seen warning labels on cigarette packs. Maybe we provide the same warnings on cannabis products. Maybe we redirect some of those tax revenues to physical activity programs. Maybe we place marijuana dispensaries next to gyms. And if you're going to go get weed, maybe you should consider working out as you make that purchase as well. Right? The possibilities are endless, but now we have the information knowing that it could become a real problem. Now we have to figure out, do we want to spend any time and energy and resources helping curb what could become a problem or a further problem in the U.S.? So that's all I have. I don't know if I took too much time or too little time, but we'll open up the floor to questions, comments, and or snide remarks. I always tell my students snide remarks are always welcome. Does this resonate?
Any questions, student?